What if I told you that nearly half of everything you do each day isn't actually a decision, but a habit? Welcome to Book Summaries channel, where today we're diving into a book that will completely change how you understand your own behavior. In The Power of Habit, award-winning journalist Charles Duhigg reveals the scientific discoveries that explain why habits exist and how they can be transformed. This groundbreaking book shows us that the key to exercising regularly, losing weight, being more productive, and achieving success is understanding how habits work. Duhigg introduces us to Eugene, a man who lost his memory but could still function through habits, demonstrating that habits are stored differently than regular memories. The chapter reveals the neurological basis of habit formation through the story of researchers at MIT who discovered the habit loop. This loop consists of three parts: a cue that triggers the behavior, a routine, which is the behavior itself, and a reward that helps your brain remember the pattern. The basal ganglia, a small neurological structure, stores habits even when the rest of the brain is damaged. Scientists discovered that habits emerge because the brain is constantly looking for ways to save effort and become more efficient. When a habit emerges, the brain stops fully participating in decision-making and diverts focus to other tasks. This process is both a blessing and a curse, allowing us to perform complex tasks automatically while also making us vulnerable to harmful patterns. The chapter explains that habits never really disappear but are encoded into brain structures. Understanding the habit loop is the first step to changing habits, because once you recognize the cue and reward, you can change the routine. This framework applies to everything from personal habits to organizational behaviors. The key insight is that you cannot eliminate bad habits, but you can change them by keeping the same cue and reward while inserting a new routine. This chapter explores why habits are so powerful by examining the role of cravings in driving habitual behavior. Duhigg tells the story of Claude Hopkins, an advertising legend who made Pepsodent toothpaste a household name by creating a craving for a tingling, fresh feeling. The chapter reveals that habits become automatic when we begin to anticipate and crave the reward. Scientists have found that cravings are what make cues and rewards work together to create habits. Without craving, cue and reward happen but don't create a strong neurological pattern. The example of Julio, a lab monkey, shows how the brain begins to anticipate rewards before they arrive, creating a neurological craving. This anticipation and craving is what powers the habit loop and makes habits so strong. Exercise habits develop when people crave the endorphin rush or sense of accomplishment. The chapter explains that Starbucks succeeded by creating a craving for their specific coffee experience. Alcoholics Anonymous works partly because it addresses the cravings that drive drinking habits. Food companies and technology firms design products specifically to trigger cravings that keep us coming back. To change a habit, you must keep the old cue and deliver the old reward, but insert a new routine that satisfies the craving. Understanding and identifying what you truly crave is essential to reshaping habits effectively. Duhigg presents the golden rule of habit change. You can't extinguish a bad habit. You can only change it by keeping the cue and reward the same while changing the routine. The chapter centers on Tony Dungy, an NFL coach who transformed the Tampa Bay Buccaneers by focusing on changing players' habits. Instead of teaching complex playbooks, Dungy simplified routines so players would react automatically to cues on the field. This approach initially showed promise but failed under pressure until players developed belief in the system. The chapter reveals that Alcoholics Anonymous succeeds not just by changing routines, but by providing belief through community and spirituality. Mandy, an alcoholic, found that AA's group aspect gave her the belief she needed when stress threatened her sobriety. Research shows that for habits to permanently change, people must believe change is possible, and often that belief emerges with the help of a group. The Golden Rule explains why AA's 12-step program works across various addictions and compulsive behaviors. Duhig's teams only achieved lasting success after tragedy brought the team together and strengthened their collective belief. The chapter demonstrates that changing a keystone habit creates a cascade of other positive changes. Whether in sports, addiction recovery, or personal development, belief is the essential ingredient that makes habit change stick. Without belief that change is possible, people revert to old patterns when stress or difficulty arises. This chapter introduces the concept of keystone habits, which are small changes that create widespread transformation throughout an organization or life. Paul O'Neill became CEO of Alcoa and shocked investors by focusing entirely on worker safety rather than profits. By making safety a keystone habit, O'Neill inadvertently transformed communication patterns, production processes, and company culture. Within a year, profits hit record highs as improved safety led to better operations overall. The chapter explains that keystone habits create cultures where excellence becomes contagious and new positive habits take root. Michael Phelps, the Olympic swimmer, developed keystone habits through visualization and relaxation routines that helped him perform under any circumstances. His coach instilled habits that helped Phelps stay calm and focused regardless of external chaos. Research on people who successfully transform their lives shows they often start with one keystone habit, like exercise. When people exercise regularly, they begin eating better, becoming more productive, smoking less, and showing more patience. Small wins, which are the results of keystone habits, trigger transformative changes by creating new structures and showing that bigger achievements are possible. The chapter demonstrates that identifying and changing keystone habits creates powerful momentum for widespread change. In organizations, keystone habits establish cultures where the right priorities automatically emerge. For individuals, cultivating keystone habits like exercise, family dinners, or making your bed creates cascading improvements across all areas of life. Duhigg reveals that willpower is the single most important keystone habit for individual success, more than intelligence or talent. Starbucks has built an empire by teaching employees willpower habits that help them deal with angry customers and stressful situations. Travis, a Starbucks employee, transformed his life by learning willpower routines for handling difficult moments. Research shows that willpower is like a muscle that gets tired from use, but can also be strengthened through practice. Students with strong willpower habits get better grades and gain admission to better schools than those with higher IQs, but less self-discipline. Starbucks creates willpower habits by training employees to anticipate inflection points when willpower is challenged. The company uses planning methods like the latte method to help employees handle specific scenarios automatically. When people plan for moments of willpower challenge, they develop automatic responses that conserve mental energy. Studies show that simply believing you're in control increases the willpower you actually possess. Starbucks empowers employees by giving them authority to make decisions, which strengthens their sense of control. The chapter demonstrates that organizations can teach willpower as a skill through training and institutional habits. Self-discipline and willpower aren't just individual traits, but can be systematically developed through practice. By anticipating challenges and creating automatic responses, anyone can strengthen their willpower muscle and achieve greater success. This chapter explores how organizational habits emerge and how crises can be opportunities to reshape those habits. Rhode Island Hospital had dangerous habits where nurses felt powerless to question doctors, leading to tragic medical errors. A crisis, including a patient death during wrong-site surgery, finally forced the hospital to change its institutional habits. Organizations operate based on truces between competing departments and power centers, creating habits that maintain peace but may be dysfunctional. When organizations are in equilibrium, These truces and habits are nearly impossible to change because too many people benefit from the status quo. Crises break equilibrium and create opportunities for leaders to remake organizational habits deliberately. The London Underground fire disaster revealed how rigid bureaucratic habits prevented effective emergency response. After the tragedy, leaders redesigned organizational habits to prioritize safety and communication. Wise leaders recognize that crises are too valuable to waste and use them to remake dysfunctional habits. The chapter shows that sometimes accidents and disasters are necessary wake-up calls that enable transformation. Leaders who seize these moments can reshape cultures by establishing new routines and priorities. However, manufactured or manipulated crises raise ethical questions about leadership and change. The key lesson is that organizational habits are most malleable during crisis periods, when people are ready for change and old power structures are weakened. Andrew Pohl, a statistician at Target, developed systems to predict customer behavior by analyzing purchasing habits. Target discovered that shopping habits are most vulnerable to change during major life events like moving, divorce, or having a baby. The company focused on identifying pregnant women because new parents' shopping habits aren't yet established. By analyzing purchases of unscented lotion, supplements, and other items, Target could predict pregnancy and even estimate due dates. The company sent customized coupons to pregnant women before they announced their pregnancies, sometimes before they told their families. One father complained after his teenage daughter received maternity ads, only to later discover she actually was pregnant. Target learned to hide their knowledge by mixing baby ads with unrelated items, so predictions seemed random rather than invasive. The chapter reveals how companies study the neurology of habits to design stores, products, and marketing. Music, lighting, store layout, and product placement all exploit habitual behaviors to increase spending. Radio stations use familiar songs sandwiched around new music to make unfamiliar songs feel comfortable through the power of habit. Companies have unprecedented power to study and manipulate consumer habits through data analysis. The ethical boundaries of this manipulation remain unclear as technology advances. Understanding how companies exploit habits helps consumers recognize and resist unwanted manipulation while making more conscious choices. Social movements succeed by transforming habits of participation through 3 stages: friendship-driven initial growth, community habits that bind people, and new self-conceptions that make participation self-sustaining. The Montgomery bus boycott succeeded because Rosa Parks was deeply embedded in social networks across the community. Her arrest activated strong social ties and the habit of reciprocal obligation within those networks. The boycott spread through weak ties, acquaintances who bridged different social groups and helped movements reach beyond close-knit circles. After initial participation, the boycott sustained itself by creating new community habits and expectations of involvement. Rick Warren built Saddleback Church into a megachurch by creating habits of participation through small groups. The church teaches members to form tight-knit groups where peer pressure creates habits of attendance and involvement. These community habits become self-reinforcing as people's identities become tied to their participation. The civil rights movement transformed from protest to sustainable change when it gave participants new self-conceptions as citizens demanding rights. Movements become self-sustaining when participation becomes part of people's social identity and habitual behavior. The chapter demonstrates that lasting social change requires more than strong leadership or noble causes. Successful movements create structures that turn participation into habit and ultimately into identity. Understanding these patterns helps activists and organizers create movements with staying power rather than fleeting protests. This chapter examines the neuroscience of habits and questions of moral responsibility through dramatic examples. Brian Thomas strangled his wife while dreaming he was fighting an intruder, acting out a habit pattern without conscious awareness. A jury found him not guilty because he genuinely had no conscious control during the incident. Angie Bachman, a gambling addict, lost her house and savings but claimed the casino exploited her habit and shouldn't be held responsible. The court rejected her argument, ruling that unlike sleepwalking, she had opportunities to recognize and change her gambling habit. The chapter explores where habit ends and choice begins in determining responsibility. Neuroscience shows that once habits form, they can operate without conscious thought, but that doesn't eliminate responsibility. The difference between Thomas and Bachman is that Bachman had moments of awareness where she could have chosen differently. Once you understand that a habit exists, you have responsibility to change it even if change is difficult. The water cure demonstrates that people can override even deeply ingrained habits with sufficient motivation and awareness. Organizations and individuals are responsible once they become aware of destructive habits, regardless of how those habits formed. The chapter concludes that habits are powerful but not destiny, and awareness creates responsibility. We cannot claim habits as excuses once we understand how they work and recognize their presence in our lives. Free will exists in the space between recognizing a habit and choosing how to respond to it. The appendix provides a practical framework for readers to identify and change their own habits using insights from the book. It emphasizes that changing habits requires identifying the routine, experimenting with rewards, isolating the cue, and having a plan. To change a habit, first identify the routine you want to change, which is the behavior itself. Next, experiment with different rewards to discover what craving is actually driving the habit loop. Try various rewards and see which ones satisfy the underlying need your habit fulfills. Isolate the cue by tracking 5 categories: location, time, emotional state, other people, and the immediately preceding action. Most habits are triggered by one of these 5 factors, so careful observation reveals the pattern. Once you've identified the cue, routine, and reward, create a plan for changing the routine when the cue appears. Write down the plan. When I see CUE, I will do routine in order to get reward. Research shows that having a written plan dramatically increases the likelihood of successful habit change. The appendix stresses that change might not be fast or easy, but using this framework makes it possible. Some habits yield quickly to analysis, while others require repeated experiments and modifications. The key is persistence and belief that change is achievable with the right approach and support system.